Hello, I'm Toby May. I'm the vicar of St James and St Luke's Church here in Glossop, and welcome to our second online service this week. And we're looking again at the story of Daniel. And I'm hoping that you've either read Daniel chapter 6 or seen it on video or something like that. And this is perhaps the most famous episode from the story of Daniel, one of the most famous in the Bible, probably. And Daniel gets thrown into that den of, oh, hold on a minute. Sorry, I've forgotten my lines. I couldn't resist that sound bite. Yes. Enough of my bad jokes. Last week, we found that Daniel and his friends were in a difficult situation. They'd been taken captive into Babylon, and everything seemed to have changed. They were in an unfamiliar land, and amongst other things, they were unable to worship in the ways that they were familiar with. And today, like Daniel and his friends, it's as if we suddenly find ourselves in an unfamiliar land. Maybe not quite threatening, but we've got to work out how to navigate these times that are so different from what we used to. And in particular, how are we church? Yes, our church buildings have closed, but we are very much open for business. Our challenge is to be church in these new times, in this unfamiliar land. I wonder how you're getting on in these times. How are you going to survive? Maybe you feel survival is just about getting the right amount of sleep and food. Maybe you work in the NHS. Maybe you're a delivery driver. Maybe you're in the supermarket, in the food chain somehow, and you feel like suddenly you're rushed off your feet and can't cope with all the demands. Or maybe you're one of those who's sitting around at the opposite extreme with loads of time in isolation, wondering, how do I occupy myself? Well, if that's you, then I have got a suggestion here. Some of you might have been trying board games. I know that Pandemic is particularly popular at this time. But there is another one I found here which might appeal to you. This one's called Isolation. Although it then says the Don't Get Stranded strategy game. Not sure about the don't get stranded bit. But we're in these strange times, aren't we? Testing times. And the question is, during these times, will we just decide we've got to survive, or will we choose to thrive? Will we just cope and get by, or will we grow during this time? This time might feel like a bit of a desert, but there are things and ways and means of growing in the desert. Think of a cactus. Growing, not just surviving, but growing in the desert. Will you survive, or will you aim to thrive? Well, as we look at this unfamiliar landscape, this new land, these strange times, last week we looked at the story of Daniel. And we started off at the beginning and we pulled out 5 Ds, you may remember. 5 Ds from Daniel. Making time to discern God's will, deciding to go God's way, denying ourselves, being disciplined, adopting new habits, and daring to take risks for God as we seek to follow Jesus in our own time. So what about this week? Well, this week we're on to this other story of Daniel, the most famous one. And Daniel was under a lot of pressure. He was in a foreign land. The customs and languages were unfamiliar. He could no longer worship how he used to. But even in that environment, he impressed the king. Why? Well, partly because he was intelligent, he was capable, but mostly, it says, because he was trustworthy and reliable. Now, it's odd though, isn't it? He was trustworthy and he was reliable, but that still seemed to make him enemies because people were jealous. And sometimes, even though we are trustworthy and reliable, even though we're keen to follow God, it's not always popular with everyone, and we face opposition. It might be direct or it might be quite subtle. And Daniel's enemies are less than subtle, really. They set a trap for him. And essentially it comes down to this. Daniel has to decide to give up on God or go to the lions. And of course, everyone knew what happens when someone was thrown into the den of lions. The first lion comes up and says, "Pleased to eat you." So, Daniel is forced to choose to survive or to thrive. Will he fit in? Will he bow down to other gods? Or will he continue to worship the one true God? Will he save himself? Or will he trust God to save him? Daniel chose thriving over surviving. He got into a pattern of going up to his room 3 times a day, looking out of a window, you might have a special place like that, and praying to God. And as the king said twice in this passage, he served God continually, no matter what. Daniel chose to keep praying, to trust God, even when it meant risking his life. He dared to be different for the sake of God. Now a question, if Daniel had avoided the den of lions, would he have survived? Well, yes, at least in the short term. Would his faith have thrived? No. By going through the den of lions, did he survive? Yes, surprisingly, although he was prepared not to. And because of that trust in God, he also thrived. Daniel's faith even had an impact on those around him. It impressed the king most of all. And although I'm not entirely sure that the king quite got the idea of all this kind of following God business, I mean, after all, he threw Daniel's accusers and their wives and their children into lions, and he ordered everyone to worship God by a kind of order of the king. I'm not sure that's entirely the recommended way to lead people to follow God. No, we don't recommend that. But the king was changed. And many years later, Jesus said this: "Whoever wants to save their own life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it." Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me, for Jesus, will find it. Find that in Matthew 16. Even if Daniel lost his physical life, he was willing to put God first. Now, our situation in the UK is nowhere near as bad as Daniel's. It's very different. It feels awful. But we live in strange times, an unfamiliar land. And some of us in these times will remain healthy. Some will get a bit ill, maybe. Some will get very ill, and a few will die. But we can all choose. What will we aim for in this time, no matter how we are physically? Will we simply aim to survive, or will we thrive? I wonder if someone, maybe a child you know, came and asked you in years to come, how did you get on in that great isolation of 2020? What did you do? Wouldn't it be great if you looked back and said, well, actually, 2020, far from just surviving, that was the year when I grew most in my faith. That was the year I trust God more. That was the year maybe I started following Jesus for the first time. That would be great. That was the year I started praying more, like Daniel. That was the year I started reading my Bible daily, maybe using some notes or the YouVersion Bible app or something. That was the year I started praying with my family out loud. That was the year I committed to my growth group. That was the year I started a friendship with that person who was lonely at the time, who now is one of my best friends, who I grow in love for, and they benefit from my love for them and me from them too. That was the year I started putting God first, with my time, with my money, with my talents. That was the year I thrived, not just survived. Just imagine how that would be. Can you imagine answering that child in that way with one of those answers or another? Wouldn't that be great?